The letter was sitting on my doormat when I got home from work on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of January, half buried under a thin dusting of fresh snow that had blown across my front porch. I almost didn't see it. I almost stepped right on it with my heavy snow boots. But something about the official-looking envelope, with the Pinecrest Ridge HOA logo embossed in dark green on the upper left corner, made me stop and pick it up before I even bothered to stomp the ice off my boots. I stood there on my porch in 14-degree weather, my breath fogging up in front of my face, and I tore open that envelope right there and then. It was a formal notice of violation. 12 full paragraphs of dense, self-important language informing me, Chris Sullivan, homeowner at 14 Ridgeline Drive, that my snowmobile trail constituted an unauthorized alteration to the natural landscape of the community, that it created a hazard for other residents, that it violated HOA Community Guidelines Section 4, Paragraph 7, Subsection B, and that if I did not cease and desist within 30 days, I would be fined $250 per day until the violation was remedied. $250 per day. I read it twice standing out in the cold before I started laughing, because here's the thing. That snowmobile trail didn't just belong to me in the casual sense, like I decided one morning to cut a path through the snow because I felt like it. That trail ran along a specific corridor on the western edge of my property, and that corridor was covered by a recorded easement that had been written directly into my deed when I purchased this house 6 years ago. It was put there by the original developer, who had specifically designated that strip of land as a recreational access corridor for snowmobile and foot traffic, connecting the back properties to the Forest Service land behind us. It was legal, it was documented, it was recorded with the county, and it predated the HOA itself by about a decade. But I didn't know any of that yet when I first bought the house. I discovered it 2 winters ago when I was refinancing, and my title company flagged the easement language during their review. The guy on the phone from the title company had said, "Oh, interesting, you've actually got a recreational access easement running along your western property line. That's actually kind of rare and kind of cool." I'd thanked him and filed it away in the back of my brain and mostly forgotten about it until the previous winter when I'd started using my snowmobile out there. The trail had been perfectly quiet. Nobody complained. My neighbors on the right, Dave and Carol, actually waved at me whenever I fired up the machine and headed out. The Hendersons behind me used the same corridor to walk their dogs to the state forest. Everything was fine. Nobody had a problem with it. And then Lorraine Mercer moved into the neighborhood. Lorraine Mercer had purchased the house at the end of Ridgeline Drive about 8 months ago, sometime in late spring. She had introduced herself by attending the very next HOA meeting and immediately proposing 4 new rules. By the following month, she was on the HOA board. By the month after that, she was effectively running it. The existing board members, a retired couple named the Osbornes and a quiet guy named Frank who mostly just wanted to make sure his fence stayed approved, had essentially yielded to her organizational energy and her very aggressive way of speaking over people at meetings. Lorraine was one of those women who treated the HOA like a personal fiefdom. She was probably in her early 50s, always wore the same style of fleece vest regardless of weather, carried a clipboard that she kept pressed to her chest like a shield, and had a way of smiling at you that didn't involve her eyes at all. She had moved here from a larger suburban development somewhere outside of Chicago and had brought with her a very urban, very aggressive interpretation of HOA governance that did not mesh well with the semi-rural, live-and-let-live culture of Pinecrest Ridge. Within her first 2 months on the board, she had issued violations to 3 of my neighbors. One was for a decorative weather vane on a roof. One was for a propane tank being visible from the road, even though the tank was behind a fence. And one was for a basketball hoop in a driveway that had been there for literally 11 years with 0 issues. My neighbor Greg Paxton, who'd owned that basketball hoop, had fought back and won because he had his original approval documentation. But the process had still taken 3 months and cost him a couple $100 in certified mail and filing fees. So when I stood on my porch in the January cold reading that violation letter, I knew exactly who had sent it, even though the letter was signed formally by the HOA board. This had Lorraine Mercer written all over it. I could practically hear her voice in the overly formal language. Unauthorized alteration to the natural landscape. That was her phrasing. She used words like that at meetings. Natural landscape. Community aesthetic. Visual integrity. I went inside, made a cup of coffee, and pulled out my home files from the cabinet in my office. It took me about 12 minutes to find the deed, which I'd actually organized pretty well after my refinancing experience. I sat down at my kitchen table, the heat clicking on overhead through the vents because the temperature outside was dropping fast as the sun went down, and I read through the deed language carefully. There it was, right on page 4 of the original deed, in the recorded instrument from the county. A formal easement clause describing a 12-foot wide corridor along the western property line, running from the road at the south end to the Forest Service boundary at the north end, designated as a perpetual access easement for non-motorized and motorized recreational use including snowmobile traffic, in accordance with the original plan development framework established by Ridgeline Development Group LLC. Perpetual, non-motorized and motorized, including snowmobile traffic. I actually said out loud to my empty kitchen, "Oh, Lorraine, you have no idea what you just started." I took photos of the deed page on my phone, and then I did something smart. I went down to my basement, fired up my space heater because the basement gets brutally cold in January, and I dug out the folder I'd gotten from my title company during the refinance. Inside that folder was a letter from the title officer confirming the easement, a copy of the original recorded document number with the county clerk, and a brief note explaining what the easement covered. Basically, a gift-wrapped defense package. I also went back and reread the HOA violation letter more carefully, this time with fresh eyes and a coffee in my hand. And I noticed something interesting. The letter claimed I was violating Section 4, Paragraph 7, Subsection B of the Community Guidelines. So I found my copy of the HOA's governing documents, which were a thick stapled packet I'd gotten at closing and had never fully read because they were deeply boring. I found Section 4. I read Paragraph 7. Subsection B said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that homeowners could not make alterations to landscaping without board approval. The thing is, I hadn't altered anything. The snowmobile trail wasn't an alteration to landscaping. It was a compressed path through snow on ground that existed before the HOA even existed. Snow. I was running a snowmobile over snow. There was no landscaping involved. The ground was frozen solid under 3 feet of accumulation. And even if there had been some technical argument about the ground underneath, the easement in my deed rendered the entire discussion moot, because the easement was a recorded legal instrument that superseded anything the HOA tried to apply to that strip of land. The HOA could not govern an easement they didn't create and didn't own. That's just basic property law. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a civil engineer who works for a regional infrastructure firm, so I deal with easements and land use documentation on a professional basis. I know how to read a deed. I know what a recorded easement means. I know that when a right of use is recorded with the county and baked into a property deed, it doesn't disappear because a homeowner association decides they don't like it. But I also knew that Lorraine Mercer wasn't going to just accept a phone call where I politely explained all of this. She wasn't that kind of person. She was the kind of person who doubled down, who escalated, who made things worse before she considered backing off. I'd watched her do it with Greg Paxton and the basketball hoop. She'd taken that to 3 separate meetings before finally conceding, and even then she'd framed her retreat as a board decision to revisit the timeline. So I decided I was going to do this properly. I wasn't going to respond informally. I was going to respond in a way that covered every angle and left absolutely no room for her to maneuver. The first thing I did was call my neighbor Dave Kowalski, who lived 2 houses down. Dave was a semi-retired contractor who lived in Pinecrest Ridge for almost 15 years, way before the HOA had been formed. Dave was one of those guys who knew everything about the neighborhood's history and was always happy to talk about it over a beer. I called him and asked if he knew anything about the original easement corridor on the western side of the properties. "Oh, sure," Dave said immediately. "That goes back to when the developer put this whole thing together. He wanted a trail system connecting the back properties to the state forest. It was part of his whole pitch when he was selling lots. There used to be a couple of families who snowmobiled back there regularly. I think it's still in the deeds for most of the lots along that side." I asked Dave if it was in his deed too. "Let me go look," he said. He put the phone down for a few minutes. I could hear him rummaging through papers. He came back and said, "Yeah, it's referenced in mine too. Same corridor. Says something about recreational access." That was interesting. Because if the easement ran through multiple properties and was referenced in multiple deeds, that made it even stronger. It wasn't some quirk specific to my lot. It was a neighborhood-wide recorded right of access that had been established at the development level. I thanked Dave and told him to hold on to that information. He asked what was going on, and I gave him the short version. There was a long pause on his end, and then he said, "Lorraine Mercer." It wasn't even a question. It was a statement of weary recognition. "Yeah," I said. "I'll spread the word," Dave said, and I told him not to do anything yet, that I wanted to handle this carefully. He agreed, but I could hear in his voice that he was already mentally composing what he was going to say to the other neighbors. The next morning I sat down and wrote my response to the HOA. I wrote it carefully, formally, and in a way that laid out the legal facts without being aggressive or emotional. I started by acknowledging receipt of the violation notice and the specific sections cited. Then I explained clearly that the corridor in question was covered by a recorded perpetual easement, noted the deed page number and the county recording instrument number, and stated that the easement specifically authorized motorized recreational use, including snowmobile traffic. I noted that this easement predated the formation of the HOA by approximately 9 years, that it was a recorded legal instrument that could not be superseded by HOA community guidelines, and that the snowmobile use was therefore fully compliant with applicable property law. I then noted, very calmly, that any attempt to impose fines related to the use of a recorded easement corridor would constitute an improper attempt to restrict a deeded property right, and that I would pursue all available legal remedies if the HOA proceeded with the threatened fines. I attached photocopies of the relevant deed page, the title company letter confirming the easement, and the county recording instrument number. I printed it, signed it, and sent it certified mail with return receipt requested. Then I made a second copy and hand-delivered it to Frank Osborne, one of the other HOA board members, because I knew Frank was reasonable and would read it carefully. And then I went about my week. It was mid-January, which meant the weather was doing absolutely everything it could to make life difficult. We'd had a big storm come through that dropped about 16 inches over 2 days, and the roads in Pinecrest Ridge were a mess. The HOA had a contract with a local plowing company, but the company had apparently prioritized the bigger commercial accounts they had in town, and our neighborhood roads were sitting under a hard-packed layer of ice and snow for 3 days. People were struggling to get out of their driveways. My neighbor Carol had called the HOA about it twice and got no response. A guy down the street, I think his name was Terry, had actually slid off his driveway trying to back out and taken out his own mailbox. Meanwhile, I was doing fine because I had a snowblower and a 4-wheel drive truck. I'd already cleared my driveway and the sidewalk in front of my house, and had also helped clear the section in front of Dave's place, because his snowblower had finally given up the ghost. The temperature had dropped to -8 overnight, which meant everything that had partially melted during the day refroze into a solid sheet of ice by morning. I actually used my snowmobile during this period to get back and forth to the state forest trail where I liked to ride, because the road access was so bad. Which meant the trail was getting regular use, which I suspected was going to annoy Lorraine even more. On the 4th day after I sent my certified letter, I got a call from Frank Osborne. Frank was genuinely apologetic. He said he'd read my response letter carefully, had looked at the deed language I referenced, and agreed that the situation needed to be reviewed by the full board before any further action was taken. He also admitted quietly that he hadn't been fully briefed on the easement issue when the violation notice was sent, and that he wished he'd known about it before his signature went on the letter. I told Frank I appreciated him being straightforward with me. I also told him that I was not looking for a fight, but that I was not going to accept fines for legal activity, and that I expected the violation notice to be formally withdrawn. Frank said he'd do his best. He also said, in a carefully diplomatic way, that the board was sometimes moving faster on certain issues than he was entirely comfortable with, which was frank speak for Lorraine is running this show and not everyone is happy about it. A week passed. Then I got another letter from the HOA. This one was shorter and more aggressive. It acknowledged my response, but stated that the board had reviewed my claims and determined that the snowmobile use was still in violation, because the HOA governing documents did not recognize pre-existing easements as exceptions to community rules, and that the easement language I cited applied to foot traffic only and did not extend to motorized vehicle use. I actually had to put the letter down and take a breath, because that second claim was so demonstrably false that it was almost funny. My deed language explicitly said non-motorized and motorized recreational use including snowmobile traffic, in the actual text. I could not have imagined more direct language if I'd written it myself. Now I was starting to get genuinely annoyed. I also noticed something in this new letter. It was signed only by Lorraine Mercer, described as acting HOA board president, not by the full board. Frank's name wasn't on it. Neither was the other board member, Helen Osborne, just Lorraine. That was interesting. I called Frank back. Frank sounded tired. He told me that there had been a board meeting 2 nights ago, which he hadn't been notified about in time to attend, and that at that meeting, Lorraine had apparently called herself acting president and reaffirmed the violation. He was not happy about it. He told me he was looking into whether that meeting had been properly noticed to all board members. I told Frank that I was going to need to consult an attorney at this point. He said, "I think that's probably the right move, Chris. I'm sorry it's come to this." I want to note here that at this point outside, it was snowing again. A slow, steady, miserable snow that started in the morning and just kept going. The kind of snow that isn't exciting or dramatic, just cold and relentless. My propane usage had spiked hard in the last week because of the sustained cold, and my heating bill for the previous month had been rough. The driveway needed clearing again. My truck had developed a slight hesitation when starting in extreme cold that I needed to get looked at. Life in January in a cold climate is a full-time project, and here I was also having to deal with this nonsense on top of all of it. I called an attorney friend of mine from work, a woman named Patricia Gaines who specialized in property and land use law. She wasn't my personal lawyer, but I'd worked with her on municipal right-of-way issues, and she knew her stuff cold. I sent her my deed, the HOA letters, my response letter, and the county recording instrument. Patricia called me back the next morning. She got straight to the point the way she always did. "Chris," she said, "your position is airtight. The easement is clear, it's recorded, it's specific, it predates the HOA's formation, and the HOA has no legal authority to restrict use of a recorded easement. If they try to fine you, they're going to lose, badly." I asked her about the HOA's claim that the easement only covered foot traffic. "That's not just wrong, it's provably wrong," she said. The language you sent me is unambiguous. They're either misreading it or they're lying about having read it. Either way, it doesn't hold up. I asked what my options were. She said I should send one final letter, this time explicitly from her as my attorney, giving the HOA 30 days to formally withdraw the violation notice and confirm in writing that no fines would be imposed, or she would initiate legal proceedings seeking an injunction against any fines and possibly damages for harassment and improper restriction of a recorded property right. I said let's do it. Patricia drafted the letter that afternoon and sent it via certified mail and email to the HOA's official contact address, with copies to all 3 board members individually. It was 4 pages long, and it was thorough in a way that only a property attorney's letter can be. It cited case law. It cited the specific county recording information. It cited the HOA's own governing documents, which, Patricia had pointed out to me with some glee, actually contained a clause in the preamble stating that the HOA's authority was subject to all recorded instruments of title affecting the properties within the community. That clause meant the HOA had essentially already acknowledged in their own documents that easements took precedence. They had argued against their own governing documents in their latest letter. Patricia made sure to point that out in detail. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had gotten wind of what was happening. Dave had apparently not been able to help himself, which I'd expected. He'd mentioned it to a couple of neighbors, and the story had spread the way things do in small communities. People were talking about it. Most of them were on my side, not just because they liked me or because Lorraine had already annoyed most of them with her various initiatives, but because a lot of them had also discovered, after Dave mentioned the easement issue, that similar language appeared in their own deeds. A guy named Marcus Webb, who lived on the north side of Ridgeline, and whose property also bordered the easement corridor, came over to my house one afternoon while I was shoveling my driveway. He was bundled up in so many layers he could barely move his arms, and he was hopping from foot to foot because of the cold. "Hey, Chris," he said, "I dug out my deed. I've got the easement too, and I've been thinking about this. If Lorraine tries to shut down your trail, it blocks my access to the forest back there for my cross-country skis too. Same corridor." I nodded and suggested he hold onto that information and maybe share it with a couple other neighbors who had similar provisions in their deeds. Marcus grinned. "Oh, I already found 4 others," he said. "Dave, Terry, the Hendersons, and me, we all have it. 5 properties with the same easement." That was, in property law terms, what's called a dominant estate cluster. Basically, it meant that multiple property owners had the same recorded right of access and could all individually enforce it. If Lorraine tried to stop one of us, she'd have to stop all of us, which meant picking 5 separate legal fights simultaneously. I texted this to Patricia, and she replied with just, "Oh, this keeps getting better." Things got quiet for about a week after Patricia's letter went out. The weather did not get quiet. We had another storm, a particularly nasty one with high winds that knocked out power to about a third of the neighborhood for almost 18 hours. People were scrambling for generators and space heaters. I actually drove around the neighborhood in my truck that night and dropped off a couple of spare propane canisters to the elderly couple, the Garcias, who lived at the far end of the road and whose usual propane delivery had been delayed because the delivery truck couldn't get up the icy access road. Small community stuff. People helping each other out. That's how Pinecrest Ridge actually worked, underneath all the HOA drama. And then Lorraine made a mistake. I found out about it secondhand first. Dave called me one afternoon and said, "You hear what Lorraine did this weekend?" I said no. He said Lorraine had gone door to door on Saturday afternoon, hitting up about 8 houses on the western side of the neighborhood, and had told each family personally that my snowmobile trail was a safety hazard, that children could be hurt, that the machine made excessive noise, and that the HOA was working to have the trail permanently shut down. She had apparently implied in at least 2 of these conversations that homeowners who supported my use of the trail might also face scrutiny for their own property compliance. That last part was a threat. Implied, but a threat. You support your neighbor, we'll look more closely at your property. I knew about this because one of the homeowners she'd visited, a woman named Janet Ferris, had taken notes during the conversation because something about it had felt off to her. Janet had then called Dave, who called me, and Janet still had the notes. But more importantly, it turned out that one of the other people Lorraine had visited was Marcus Webb. And Marcus, it turned out, had a very nice video doorbell camera with audio recording. He'd answered the door and Lorraine had launched into her pitch, entirely unaware that every word was being captured in HD. I went over to Marcus's house the next day. He pulled up the footage on his laptop while I sat in his kitchen drinking coffee and trying to warm up after the walk over, because it was 11 degrees and even a short walk in that temperature is unpleasant when the wind is going. The footage was clear. Lorraine at his front door, clipboard pressed to her chest, smiling her eye-free smile, telling Marcus that the snowmobile trail was dangerous and that the HOA was going to shut it down regardless of what Chris Sullivan claimed about his deed. And then toward the end of the clip saying clearly, "And I just encourage you to think carefully about where your loyalties lie in this community, because the board is going to be taking a closer look at a few things on this side of the neighborhood." That was a pretty direct implied threat, and it was on video. I texted Patricia a screenshot from the footage with a short summary. She called back in 20 minutes. She said, "Send me the full clip. We need that." I got Marcus to send it to her directly. Patricia said that what Lorraine had done was arguably tortious interference, and the implied threat to increase property scrutiny as a form of intimidation could potentially rise to the level of HOA board misconduct under state law, depending on how aggressive we wanted to get. She said let's include it in the record and see how the HOA responds to her letter first. The deadline on Patricia's letter was 30 days. At the 20-day mark, I got a response. It was not what I expected. It was another aggressive letter, again signed only by Lorraine as acting president, stating that the board had taken the matter under advisement, did not accept the legal characterization of the easement, and was proceeding with the original fine structure, meaning I would begin accruing fines in 10 days. I called Patricia immediately. She said, "Okay, we file." I said go ahead. But something else happened around the same time that changed the complexion of things significantly. Frank Osborne had been doing some digging of his own. He'd pulled the HOA's incorporation documents and bylaws, and he discovered something that Lorraine had apparently overlooked or ignored when she'd called herself acting president and held that unnoticed board meeting. The HOA bylaws very clearly stated that the position of board president could only be filled through a formal election among board members, with all 3 board members present and notified at least 72 hours in advance. Lorraine had never been formally elected president. She had simply started calling herself acting president. And the meeting at which she'd reaffirmed the violation notice had not been properly noticed to Frank or Helen, meaning it was not a valid board meeting under the bylaws, which meant every action Lorraine had taken as acting president was potentially void. The violation reaffirmation letter, the decision to proceed with fines, all of it possibly invalid because it hadn't been done through proper board procedure. Frank brought this to Helen and they agreed. They drafted a notice to all community members calling for an emergency HOA meeting to address concerns about board governance. I found out about this meeting the day before it happened, when Frank personally dropped a notice in my mailbox. The meeting was set for the following Thursday evening at the community room at the neighborhood entrance building, which was a small heated space that was usually used for the summer block party planning sessions and occasional board meetings. Attendance was going to be open to all residents. The Thursday of the meeting, it was snowing again. Of course it was. At this point, I felt like January had it out for us personally, but people showed up anyway. I counted 23 homeowners packed into that little community room, which had a maximum comfortable capacity of maybe 12. People were standing along the walls in their coats and snow boots, breath condensing in the air near the door every time someone came in. Lorraine was there too, clipboard in hand, looking like she'd expected a smaller turnout and was recalibrating. Frank opened the meeting and immediately got into the governance issue. He laid it out simply and clearly. Lorraine had never been properly elected president. The board meeting where the violation reaffirmation had been decided was not validly noticed to all board members, and therefore any decisions made at it were not properly authorized. He said this was not personal, it was a procedural matter, and the board needed to address it. Lorraine jumped in immediately. She said Frank was being obstructionist, that she had taken the title of acting president in good faith to manage board operations efficiently, that the HOA needed decisive leadership, and that this meeting was a distraction from the real issue, which was the Snowmobile trail. Several people started talking at once. Dave stood up and said loudly, "With respect, Lorraine, you've been sending violation notices and threatening fines as a president you were never elected to be. That's not a distraction. That's the whole issue." Lorraine smiled her smile and said that the board had determined the Snowmobile trail was a violation and that was going to stand. I raised my hand. Frank nodded at me. I stood up and said calmly that I wanted to share some information with the community. I'd brought printouts, which I passed around the room. Each printout showed the deed easement language and the county recording instrument number. I explained what the easement was, what it covered, and why the HOA's violation notice was legally without merit. I explained that Patricia Gaines had already filed for an injunction in district court to prevent the fines from being imposed. The room was very quiet while I talked. Then Marcus Webb stood up and said that he also had the easement in his deed, and that Lorraine had come to his house and suggested that residents who supported me might face increased HOA scrutiny. He said he had doorbell camera footage of that conversation and had provided it to my attorney. The room shifted. I could feel it. That collective moment when people stop treating something as a neighborhood squabble and start treating it as something more serious. Janet Ferris stood up and said Lorraine had said similar things to her and that she'd taken notes. Lorraine said, "I was simply informing residents of the board's position." Someone from the back called out, "That's not what the footage shows." Frank said he wanted to formally move that the board take no further action on the Sullivan violation until the matter was resolved through proper legal process, and that a formal presidential election among board members be held at this meeting. Helen seconded it. Lorraine said that motion was out of order. Frank said it absolutely was not and read directly from the bylaws. The vote was Frank in favor, Helen in favor, Lorraine against, 2-1. The motion passed. Lorraine's face went very still. That smile disappeared for the first time since I'd met her. The board then voted on a proper presidential election. Frank ran and Helen seconded him. Lorraine refused to participate in the vote. Frank was elected president by a vote of 2-1, with Lorraine casting a no vote that didn't change the outcome. The room broke into actual applause, not thunderous or dramatic. Just genuine, tired relief from 20-some neighbors who'd been watching Lorraine run this thing like a one-woman operation for months. After the meeting, Frank pulled me aside and quietly told me that the board, now with him as properly elected president, would be formally withdrawing the violation notice against me. He said he'd have the written withdrawal to me by end of that week. I thanked him and told him I'd let Patricia know to pause the injunction filing to see if the formal withdrawal resolved things cleanly. The written withdrawal arrived 3 days later, delivered certified mail. It was official HOA letterhead, signed by Frank Osborne as board president and co-signed by Helen as board secretary. It stated clearly that the violation notice issued to Chris Sullivan of 14 Ridgeline Drive regarding snowmobile use was formally withdrawn, that the board had reviewed the matter and determined that the use in question was covered by a recorded easement in Mr. Sullivan's deed, and that no fines had been or would be imposed. Patricia reviewed it and said it was clean. She filed a notice with the court that the matter had been resolved without the need for injunctive relief, and we closed the case. But the story doesn't quite end there. Over the next few weeks, a few things happened that were worth noting. The first was that Marcus, Dave, Janet, and 2 other neighbors filed a formal complaint with the board against Lorraine for the doorbell footage incident, specifically for the implied threat that residents who supported my position would face increased HOA scrutiny. Frank took that complaint seriously. He retained the HOA's own attorney to review the footage and Janet's notes and provide a formal legal opinion. The attorney's opinion came back saying that the conduct Lorraine had engaged in, specifically implying enforcement consequences for residents based on their association with a particular homeowner in a dispute with the board, constituted potential abuse of HOA authority and was inconsistent with the fiduciary duty owed by board members to all homeowners. The opinion recommended the board take formal action. The board held another meeting, properly noticed this time, with all 3 members present. Frank and Helen voted to formally censure Lorraine for conduct unbecoming a board member and to place a 60-day suspension on her board activities pending a community review. Lorraine was given the opportunity to respond at the meeting, which she did, mostly by arguing that everyone was ganging up on her and that she had only been trying to improve the community. Helen, who had been very quiet throughout all of this, said in a measured voice that improving the community meant following its own rules, including the rules about how the board operated, and that the community didn't need improvement through threats and procedural violations. It was, honestly, one of the more quietly devastating things I'd ever seen said at a meeting. Lorraine submitted her resignation from the board 11 days later. The resignation letter was brief, stiff, and contained no acknowledgement of anything she'd done wrong. It said only that she was stepping back from her volunteer role due to the hostile environment that had developed within the community and that she wished the board well. Dave called me to tell me about it. He sounded like he'd just watched the home team win the championship. He could barely keep the glee out of his voice. "She's gone, man," he said. "She actually quit." I told him that was probably better for everyone, including her. I genuinely meant it. The HOA seat left by Lorraine's resignation was filled by a community election held in late February. A retired schoolteacher named Barbara Nolan got it, running essentially on the platform of, "I will be normal and not harass anyone," which was apparently exactly what the neighborhood wanted because she won by a comfortable margin. With Barbara on the board, Frank as president, and Helen as secretary, things returned to the kind of relaxed, neighborly governance that Pinecrest Ridge had apparently been known for before Lorraine's arrival. Frank told me at one point that under the new administration, they were focusing on 3 things: getting the plow contract fixed so it was actually enforced, updating the community common areas, and reviewing the existing violation notices that had been sent over the past year to make sure they were all legitimate. Several of them, it turned out, weren't. The weather vane violation, the propane tank violation, and a couple others were all withdrawn after review. Greg Paxton, who'd fought the basketball hoop violation, got a formal letter of apology from the board. He framed it, which I think was the right call. By the end of February, the neighborhood had genuinely transformed. Not because anything dramatic or revolutionary had happened, but because the low-level anxiety and tension that Lorraine's presence had created had simply lifted. People were waving at each other from driveways again. There was talk of a neighborhood soup night at the Faireyes' house. Dave finally got himself a new snowblower and made a big production of clearing 3 driveways in a row the morning after the next storm like he was doing victory laps. And the Snowmobile trail, still there. I rode it every decent weekend for the rest of the winter. The Hendersons kept using the same corridor for their dog walks. Marcus got out on his cross-country skis a few times. Nobody was bothered. Nobody complained. It was just a quiet strip of packed snow along the western edge of the neighborhood, connecting the back lots to the state forest, exactly as the developer had intended when he recorded that easement into the deeds all those years ago. I did make one addition. After the whole thing was over, I put up a small wooden sign at the southern entrance to the corridor, right where it meets the road at the edge of my property. It just says Pinecrest Ridge Trail Access Public Recreational Easement S 1987. Nothing flashy, just informational. Frank saw it and laughed. He said, "That's perfect, Chris." I think it is, honestly. It's accurate, it's polite. And it permanently documents exactly what that corridor is and always has been, so that nobody in the future, no matter how many clipboards they carry or how many violation letters they draft, can ever again pretend it isn't there. There's a thing about living in a community, whether it's a neighborhood or a smaller group, that gets lost sometimes when power concentrates in the wrong place. The thing is that most people don't actually want conflict. They want to be left alone to live their lives, to enjoy their property, to wave at their neighbors, to ride their snowmobiles on a legal access corridor without getting threatening letters in the mail. Most people are reasonable. Most people cooperate. Most people will extend their neighbors the same courtesy they'd want extended to them. The problem comes when someone decides that community governance is about control rather than service. When someone uses volunteer authority as a personal tool for enforcing their own preferences on other people who never asked for that. When someone can't distinguish between genuine community standards and their own specific version of how they think other people should live. Lorraine Mercer was that kind of person. She probably didn't even fully recognize it in herself. She probably genuinely believed she was improving things. But good intentions run through a faulty understanding of authority produce bad outcomes, and the bad outcomes she produced ended up collapsing back on her when the actual legal and procedural structures reasserted themselves. The deed said what it said. The county record said what it said. The HOA's own bylaws said what they said. Those documents don't care about clipboards or volunteer titles or implied threats at doorsteps. They just sit there in filing cabinets and county record offices, quietly waiting for the moment someone needs them. I needed them. I had them. And that was that. There's a particular quiet satisfaction that comes from winning a fight not through anger or aggression, but through simply knowing your rights and being patient enough to let the documentation do the talking. I didn't yell at Lorraine. I didn't make scenes at meetings. I sent certified letters, hired a good attorney, and documented everything. The system worked the way it was supposed to work, which doesn't always happen but in this case did. By the time March rolled around, and the snowpack started to soften around the edges during the warm parts of the afternoon, things at Pinecrest Ridge were genuinely good. The plow contract had been renegotiated, and we had actual reliable service for the remainder of the winter. The icy roads that had been such a headache in January were now being properly maintained. The Garcias down the end of the road had gotten their propane delivery situation sorted out, and Frank had actually added a provision to the HOA's community communications requiring advance notice to residents before road conditions were expected to prevent delivery access, so people could plan ahead. The soup night at the Ferrises' house happened in early March. About 18 people came. It was warm inside, cold and dark outside, and everybody brought something. Dave brought cornbread. I brought a big pot of beef stew that I'd been simmering since noon. The Hendersons brought their famous jalapeno cheese dip, which is aggressively named, but actually pretty mild. Janet Ferris made 2 enormous pots of chicken vegetable soup from scratch. We ate and we talked, and we laughed about the whole HOA situation with the comfortable, slightly disbelieving humor of people who'd come through something ridiculous and had made it to the other side intact. Greg Paxton raised his soup bowl and said, "To people who read their deeds," and everyone laughed and clinked bowls. I rode the trail one last time in mid-March, on a Sunday morning when the snow was still solid enough but you could tell it was on borrowed time. The forest behind the neighborhood was quiet, the trees heavy with late winter snow, the light coming through at a low angle and turning everything gold and blue. I rode out to the edge of the state forest boundary and just sat there for a few minutes with the engine off, listening to nothing. It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. I rode back in, parked the snowmobile in my garage, and went inside to make coffee. The sun was bright on the snow outside my kitchen window. My phone had a text from Dave saying he was going to tackle his driveway later and did I want to come over for a beer after. I texted back, yes. Somewhere in whatever HOA community Lorraine Mercer eventually moved to next, if she moved to one, I genuinely hope she would find a way to channel her energy into something that actually helped people. Make a neighborhood better, organize a cleanup, plan a community event. Do something constructive with all that organizational energy, instead of weaponizing it against neighbors who just wanted to ride their snowmobiles in peace. But if she picked up that clipboard again and started writing violation notices for things that weren't actually violations, I hope the person on the receiving end would pull out their deed, find their easement, and make the right call. Because the documentation is always there, sitting quietly in a county record office or a filing cabinet or a refinancing folder, just waiting for someone to need it. Find your easement, read your deed, know your rights, and send everything certified mail. The last piece of the story came about 6 weeks after Lorraine resigned, in a way I didn't see coming. It turned out that one of the neighbors Lorraine had visited during her door-to-door campaign, a man named Phil Ender, who hadn't been at the big community meeting, had actually recorded his own conversation with her on his phone because, as he put it, something about her visit had felt legally weird, and he wanted a record. He'd captured her saying that if I continued to use the trail, the HOA would pursue action to have my property access permanently restricted through the courts, which was not just wrong as a legal claim. It was a claim she had absolutely no authority to make on behalf of the HOA, even if it had been legally coherent, which it wasn't. Phil had passed that recording along to Patricia after hearing through Dave about the doorbell camera footage. Patricia reviewed it and said it was worth preserving because it constituted additional evidence of Lorraine acting outside her authority and making false legal representations. She incorporated it into a comprehensive file she was keeping in case anything arose later. Nothing arose later. Lorraine stayed resigned, stayed quiet, and by April had apparently listed her house for sale. I heard this from Dave, who heard it from the Hendersons, who had seen a real estate agent put up a sign. I don't know where she went after that. Somewhere warmer, I hoped. Somewhere with no snowmobile trails for her to worry about. The house sold in May to a young couple who seemed, from the brief wave and introduction I did over the fence shortly after they moved in, genuinely pleasant. They had a toddler and a big, easygoing dog. The dog immediately became friends with the Henderson dog. The toddler immediately became interested in my truck. Normal neighborhood stuff. The good kind. Frank stopped by my house one evening in late spring to return a tool I'd lent him for a fence repair, and we stood in my driveway for a while talking. The snow was long gone, and the ground was soft and green, and the air smelled like thaw and mud and new grass. The whole brutal winter felt like something from a different lifetime, even though it had been just a few months ago. Frank said he'd been thinking about updating the HOA governing documents to include an explicit acknowledgement that recorded easements and other instruments of title were not subject to HOA restriction. He wanted it to be clear in writing, so there could never be another situation like the one we'd just been through. I told him that was a good idea and that Patricia would probably be willing to review the draft language for a reasonable fee if he wanted a professional eye on it. He said he'd reach out to her. Then he said, "You know what the funny thing is? When I first joined the board, I never thought I'd have to know this much about property law." I laughed and told him that was usually how it went. You never think you need to know this stuff until you suddenly need to know it very badly. He agreed. Then he said goodnight and went home through the long summer evening light. And I stood in my driveway for a moment, just enjoying the absolute quiet normalcy of a neighborhood in spring. Everybody living their lives. Nobody threatening anyone. No violation notices in the mailbox. The western corridor behind my house, just a strip of soft mud and emerging grass waiting for winter to make it into something rideable again. It would come back around. It always does. The cold, the snow, the silence of a winter morning. And when it did, I'd fire up the snowmobile and ride the same trail I'd always ridden, on the same easement that had always been there, documented in the same deed that had always protected it. And it would be just exactly as good as it always had been.